Does this picture look familiar to you? Look a bit closer. If you're a white middle-class American, then odds are it does. If not, then let me explain. This picture was posted by former presidential candidate Mitt Romney to Facebook, celebrating the Romney family's 2021 Christmas celebration. You've probably seen hundreds of Facebook posts, holiday cards, and pictures that look just like this one. Hell, you might even be in pictures that look just like it. Growing up in a predominantly white family, most of our family reunions looked a little bit like this one. Alright, well, you can't choose your family members, but what about your friends? Why are all of my friends also white? I like to think that I'm someone who values diversity and tries to seek out experiences with distinct communities and backgrounds, but all too often, I find myself in rooms where most everyone shares my skin color. This is something that I sometimes feel guilty about. But what I want to explore in this video is that our individual choices aren't as significant as we might think. You see, a lot of things we sometimes attribute to our personal preferences, like the neighborhood we live in, the school we attend, the career we pursue. These choices are actually heavily influenced by factors outside of our control. Mitt Romney didn't really choose to live in the affluent suburbs and attend prep school, any more than I chose to grow up in a small town in Mississippi and attend public school. But both of those experiences deeply influenced the communities we built and the friends that we made. What I would proffer is that more than individual choice, government policy, often written and enacted by a tiny and powerful and, yes, largely lily-white segment of the population, is the answer to my question. And I don't think I'm the only one who feels this way. In fact, I would submit that this generation of Americans is actually more racially segregated than the generation before us, and that this retreat from multiculturalism has had profound effects on the way we treat one another. But to support this claim, we need to take a look at some evidence. First, a 2021 Cal Berkeley study found that American cities are actually more racially segregated today than they were 30 years ago. Quote,
out of every metropolitan region in the United States with more than 200,000 residents, 81% were more segregated as of 2019 than they were in 1990.
A separate study from Stanford found that our schools followed a similar pattern.
That segregation between white and black students has increased by 64% since 1988.
But if you don't believe the lib-pilled studies from the coastal Ivy League elites, that's fine. Fair enough. But explain this.
Oh, look at these two. All right, come on, you're okay? Oh, what? Either they're having an affair or they're just very shy.
That's right. I know you've seen it. It's the astronomy CEO cheating on his wife at a Coldplay concert. David1931 on Twitter said it best.
Getting caught having an affair with an executive at a Coldplay concert gotta be top 5 whitest things in history.
He's absolutely right. We are witnessing heretofore unparalleled levels of whiteness. That Coldplay clip alone is motivation enough to go on this quest. I can't in good conscience continue to associate with this many whites. It's bad for the Benaminute brand. So let's dive into this, and let's figure out why all my friends are white. Hey, it's been a minute, and welcome back to another episode of How the F Did We Get Here? A series where I trace back the fault lines of our nation's obscenely racist heritage to figure out how the hell our 2025 immigration policy became white South Africans only. So in this video, I want to explore 4 key policies throughout American history that I believe contributed to why we're still so racially divided today. Before we dive into these 4 policies, I do want to add a couple of disclaimers to this video just so y'all don't get the wrong idea. First, I won't be covering slavery today. The basic reason for that is honestly just because America's legacy of slavery is so long and so violent and its impact so devastating that I truly couldn't hope to cover a fraction of it in this 30-minute long video. To be clear, the 2.5 centuries of brutal and despicable American chattel slavery underpin all of the topics that I'm going to address today in this video. The second disclaimer is, obviously, not all of my friends are white. The title of this video is hyperbolic and used for satirical purposes. I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but we do live in a post-irony time, so I thought I'd be safe. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started. One thing that I've noticed about people's general understanding of racism and segregation in the post-slavery United States is that it's sort of simplistic. In fact, I find it often boils down to one very sinister and easy to remember name: Jim Crow. The laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States from the period after the Civil War until the Civil Rights era were cruel and repulsive, more than deserving of the enduring ignominy they've since garnered in the public consciousness. But they're made even more dark when you realize that it almost didn't happen this way. In my opinion, the election of 1876 and the resulting compromise of 1877 is simultaneously one of the most devastating and under-discussed events in American history.
And I'll explain why in just a minute. But first, a quick word from this video's sponsor. You know how shaving companies have basically been lying to us for decades? Selling you razors with like 5 blades on it, a vibrating handle, like a lubrication strip that's basically just like glue for your face. And then after all of that, your neck still looks like you took a cheese grater to it. Well, it turns out that that is by design. The more irritation they cause, the more aftercare garbage they can sell you to fix it. But Henson Shaving is the first razor I've ever used that actually makes me feel like they want me to have skin after I shave. I actually heard about Henson Shaving from another YouTube ad read like 4 years ago, and I was pretty intrigued because I've always dealt with like red rashes and cuts from other shaving products, and the other YouTuber said that Henson Shaving would fix all of that. Well, obviously I was a bit skeptical, but I ended up buying one, and it's the last razor I've ever purchased. And this is still the actual one. They sent me a new one for this ad read, but I'm still using the original that I bought 4 years ago. So if you're not familiar, the Henson razor is a single precision blade, machined in the same facility that's built parts for the Mars rover and the International Space Station. There's no flex or swivels or any kind of gimmicks. It's just a perfectly supported blade at the exact 30-degree angle it should be, every single time. The razor has less friction, less irritation, and the blades for it literally cost 10 cents a pop. I mean, you can't really beat that. So if you want to buy your last razor right now, you can go to hensonshaving.com/Benaminute or use code Benaminute at checkout to get 100 blades totally for free. That's over 2 years worth of shaving. Just make sure both products are in the cart for the code to take effect. If you're tired of paying more to feel worse, to me, the Henson razor is your answer. After all, it was mine. And thank you to Henson Shaving for sponsoring this video. All right, back to it.
You see, in the decade of Reconstruction following the Civil War, the country actually experienced one of the fastest and most radical transformations of civil rights in its entire history. Black men, of course it was men only, were granted citizenship, protection under the law, and the right to vote through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Of course, there was marked resistance from white Southern Democrats and a hostile and viciously bigoted President in Andrew Johnson, who once famously remarked, Fun fact, even in the 1860s, Andrew Johnson was considered amongst his peers to be a particularly racist guy. Think about that. Literal slave owners were like, geez, this guy's taking it a bit too far. But despite this, radical Republicans, this is before the parties flipped by the way, in Congress were actually able to effectively advocate for a more robust approach to Reconstruction. As a result, during this decade, Black communities in the South began to build new lives. Black people voted. They held office, they created schools. Now, it was far from perfect, and Southern racism was still entrenched and virulent, but there was real and relatively rapid progress. Black people finally started to be treated as human beings. And then came the election of 1876. It was a harrowingly close and hotly contested presidential election, with neither candidate, Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, or Democrat Samuel Tilden, securing a clear majority victory. The country brokered a backroom deal known as the Compromise of 1877. Hayes would get the presidency, but in exchange, the federal troops who oversaw the first decade of Reconstruction would withdraw. It's hard to overstate how rapidly a catastrophic collapse followed. You see, the successes of the post-Civil War Reconstruction were almost entirely contingent on these troops serving as a watchdog. Once federal oversight disappeared, Reconstruction collapsed almost instantly. Southern states simply replaced slavery with sharecropping. White mobs intensified vigilante violence campaigns, and strict voter suppression laws were swiftly enacted. In short, the Republicans, the so-called Party of Abolition and Equal Rights, made a political choice. They made a trade to get their man in power, and in return, they got the Jim Crow South. And while the South perfected segregation in the open, the North got busy inventing their own version. One that hid behind paperwork and zoning maps. Enter. In contrast to the more clearly codified Jim Crow of the South, Pre-civil rights segregation in the North often receives the rather generous distinction of de facto segregation. De facto is defined by Webster's dictionary as
resulting from economic or social factors rather than from laws or actions of the state.
Under that definition, I can definitely tell you that Northern de facto segregation is a myth, and a pernicious one. You see, the term de facto gives this false impression that segregation in the North was sort of a racist whoopsie, an unintentionally bigoted byproduct of other factors like housing policy, restrictive debt covenants, and social preferences. Maybe the best example of disproving this notion is redlining. Redlining was a government-sanctioned system of housing discrimination that began in the 1930s, when the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created residential security maps to assess mortgage risk. These maps weren't just advisory, they were used by banks, insurers, and federal agencies to decide who got loans and who didn't. And spoiler alert, but if you were black or brown, you didn't. Today, you can go to the University of Richmond website, Mapping Inequality, and actually search these redlining maps, taking note of how neighborhoods in your city were divided and categorized. It sounds almost absurdly simple and stupid, but neighborhoods were color-coded into 4 categories. For example, this is Brooklyn from 1938. Green equals rich whites. Blue equals middle-class whites. Yellow equals poor whites and immigrants. And red equals black and brown people. It was crayon-eating stupid policy. Sort of like racist kindergarten. Let's say that you are one of the lucky few people being employed by the federal government during the worst economic collapse of your lifetime, the Great Depression. Your job is to describe neighborhoods based on a rubric handed to you by your boss, which includes describing geographical features. Is the land hilly? Are there natural water features like streams or lakes? Next, you would be prompted to list favorable and unfavorable influences, including the presence of parks, rec centers, traffic, proximity to manufacturing facilities, or quote, infiltrations of lower grade population or different racial groups. You know, it was just normal questions that you might ask your realtor. The rubric called for more data like the presence of absence of apartments, what people in the neighborhood did for work, and how much money they made. That ostensibly would factor into the area's final score. Neighborhoods that wound up getting the lowest rating of hazardous had one thing in common despite what all the other data you noted might have suggested. The residents were mostly black. For instance, the note for Queens, neighborhood D34, which simply reads Negro Colony, or in Oakland D15, where they write predominance of foreign inhabitants, infiltration of Negroes and Orientals. Living in lowly rated neighborhoods made one's life immensely more difficult. It was more difficult to get loans. It was more difficult to own a home, more difficult to be hired.
If there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
And it's important to understand that none of this was by accident, or the result of a few bad apples. Redlining and other segregationist policies were explicit and systemic. It was the federal government deliberately oppressing and segregating people based on skin color. And once those housing policies had locked in those racial and economic divides, the government doubled down with new tools of oppression. Chief among them was the so-called war on drugs. Because sometimes I guess segregation just isn't enough. In a 1971 speech, Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number 1.
America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse,
and launched a federal offensive to combat it. By 1973, Nixon's administration had founded the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA. And in the 1980s, the Reagan administration supercharged these efforts by introducing mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses in the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986.
I can report to you that we've made much progress. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels.
To go back to our earlier discussion of the myth around de facto segregation, the war on drugs represented another sneaky effort by American political leaders to fuel racial disparities without outright publicly saying something like, racism is good, and we like it. Nominally, at least, the war on drugs policy was race blind. The publicly stated goals were to promote public health, combat addiction, maybe arrest a few stinky hippies. So how do we know that the motivations were in fact racist? Well, there was one flaw in their plan. Here's John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy chief, explaining the administration's rationale.
The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
That's right. Our political leaders outright and publicly stated that the reason behind the war on drugs was that racism is good, and we like it. GOP political operative Lee Atwater expressed the same sentiment, albeit even more racistly.
You start out in 1954 by saying by 1968, you can't say that hurts you, backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this as much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than.
If the goal of the war on drugs was, as Ehrlichman insists, to make it illegal to be black, then it can only be considered to have been a resounding success. According to the author of The New Jim Crow, drug-related charges accounted for more than half the rise in state prisons between 1985 and 2000. During that same period, the black and Latino incarceration rate grew at a rate far outpacing their white counterparts. Today, black Americans are imprisoned at 5 times the rate of white Americans. And although the overall prison population has declined from its peak in 2009, it still stands at roughly 6 times the size it was before the war on drugs, putting more people in cages than any other country on Earth. America first, baby. Now all America needed to do was build an industry around keeping them locked up. Can you guess what's next? The prison industrial complex refers to the economic link between incarceration and the associated businesses incarceration delivers profit to. Private prisons, surveillance companies, businesses using cheap prison labor. The war on drugs helped turn racist policing expressly meant to disproportionately affect people of color into big business for the United States government.
The prison industrial complex starts early in the lives of black and brown kids,
who are more likely to live in households affected by the war on drugs of the 1970s. And who today are attending a school that has been understaffed, underfunded, and under attack for decades. While there's been an increase in the incarceration of black and brown adults and children since the 1970s, we have seen a not dissimilar doubling of the number of suspensions and expulsions since the 70s in public schools. When we saw the enforcement of mandatory minimums and 3-strike policies devastate black adult communities, we saw a rise in the enforcement of zero-tolerance policies in schools in the 1990s, where expulsion was handed out like gold stars regardless of circumstance. Where schools could have used more funding for teachers, counselors, and administrators, they instead are being supplemented with police forces. Nothing screams education more like roll call at 7 a.m. in a hallway armed with policemen and dogs, food served on those little trays that you can find in prisons, and the constant threat of being sent to an alternative school should you find your conditions unsatisfactory.
It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask, what made them do this? They must be taken off the street.
Capitalism is driven by its need to consume. The United States government realized in the 1930s that prisons weren't just an easy place to get rid of communists, instigators, and other undesirables. They were also becoming reserves of untapped labor. And not just any labor, cheap labor. And sometimes even free labor. In 1934, by executive order signed by Franklin Roosevelt, Federal Prisons Industries, Inc. was created. Today, federal law mandates that all physically able inmates work for Unicor or other in-prison jobs. Unicor employees work for somewhere between 23 cents and $1.10 per hour. Unicor produces electronics, uniforms, and equipment for our military, and even office furniture. The United States also has a long history of using private prisons to help satiate our hunger for incarceration. The private prison system first operated as a response to the end of the transatlantic slave trade in the 1800s and the ensuing Civil War. In some instances, runaway slaves were recaptured by bounty hunters employed by private prisons in order to be sold back into slavery. And even free black people were captured and illegally sold into slavery. Some plantations were even converted into private prisons, like the plantation that would eventually become Louisiana State Penitentiary and the nation's largest state prison. The penitentiary is still colloquially referred to as Angola, which was a nod to the country of origin for a large number of people who were enslaved there in the antebellum South. Due to the ballooning prison population brought on by the war on drugs, our modern private prisons started to really take shape in the 1980s. Studies have shown that when compared to state-run facilities, private prisons pay their employees less, have higher inmate-to-staff ratios, and have lower requirements for employee training. These shortcomings lead to unsafe conditions, even by prison standards. Of course, the biggest issue for private prisons is their main goal is the same as any private business: to turn a profit. If a prison has open beds for inmates, then there's a financial incentive to fill those beds. Once they have those beds filled, private prisons prey on the inmates and their families by charging exorbitant rates for simple goods, like underwear and other basic needs. If something about this system sounds eerily familiar, this is indentured servitude for the chance to buy a stick of deodorant, or a 15-minute call that is literally the only thing that's tethering you to the outside world.
In fact, there are now more black males in the prison system than in the education system in the relevant ages. In fact, what the criminal system is simply being used as a war against, literally a war against an unwanted part of the population. A part of the population that used to be industrial workers, or at least have the opportunity to and maybe work themselves up, but now just have no rights, because you don't need that anymore. You can get them cheaper somewhere else.
The form of racism has changed over the years in the United States. From slavery, to Jim Crow, to states' rights, to tough on crime, to America first. But the function has always been the same: to punish black and brown people for the color of their skin. This through line of racial control isn't accidental. It reflects a deliberate, generation-spanning strategy in which every new era simply rebrands the same core objective: maintaining white dominance by reshaping laws, institutions, and economies to keep black and brown communities at a permanent disadvantage. What was the title of this video again? Oh yeah. So, why are all my friends white? Well, it's because given every opportunity to do something different, the United States chose to govern based on race. We decided where black people were allowed to live and not live. We decided how black people were going to live, and just how excruciating we would make that for them. And when we decided our ever-changing racism was all a bit generous of us, we decided to reenact slavery as best we could by incarcerating black people for whatever reason we dreamed up. Because since its inception, the United States government has decided that the idea behind a more perfect union must mean a whiter one. But I do want to leave you with this, because quite frankly, it pisses me off. In 2022, Ron DeSantis and his gang of morons in Florida passed the Stop Woke Act, which restricts the way race and gender are discussed in public schools. It prohibits teachers from making students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. Oh, I'm sorry. Does it hurt your little feelings that your great-great-uncle Talbot owned another human being? Good. That's great. It means that you still have a shred of empathy and aren't yet an irredeemable white national psycho. Look, this is why the adage of "I don't see color" rings false to me. If our generation goes colorblind, we'll be the first in American history. Because I damn sure promise you that our parents, their parents, and their parents' parents saw color. You just might not be proud of what they saw. As a lot of you know, I grew up in Mississippi, where race permeates everything. It has a despicable, vile history of racism that it's still reckoning with. But it's also the state of the highest percentage of black people in the entire country. I grew up around lots of people with a different skin color and from a different cultural background. And I know that I'm a better person for it. It cultivated my sense of humor, my taste in art and music, and the way that I treat other people. That's why I want to take back diversity from the anti-woke and anti-DEI crowd. Rebrand it. Call it whatever you want. But diversity is a good thing, because I know that I would be a lot worse off if all of my friends were actually white. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it as always. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment, like it, subscribe. It helps my channel grow, it helps the algorithm out a lot, so I would really appreciate that. And an extra thank you to my Patreons and members for supporting my channel. If you want to join my Patreon, I upload ad-free videos early on there. I also post updates to my videos before they come out, and a lot of fun and extra stuff that I think you'd enjoy.